based on the preview we had as kind of a test run a few nights ago, I think you all thoroughly enjoy what they've come up with. So please allow me to present the Madison Astronomical Society History Committee.
So let me just make a couple quick comments before we go over to Kevin, who's going to start. First of all, we think that this discussion is probably going to stimulate a lot of questions and comments tonight, and we want to encourage you to just go ahead and ask. You don't need to raise your Zoom hand. You don't have to type your question into the chat window. If you have a question, just ask it. But we're going to ask everybody who is not speaking to mute themselves now so that we don't have any extraneous noise interrupting. But if you want to ask a question, just unmute yourself and wait for that natural pause in the conversation and stick your question right in there, and we'll try to get to all of them that we can. We've got a lot to get through, and I'm going to be watching the time, but we're going to start with Kevin. So Kevin, take it away.
Thanks, John. The first thing, I'm not sure how many people have ever actually looked at the cover of the logbook that you log in and when you go to YRS. But one of the things that the committee decided to do was we thought that the logbook itself would provide an excellent source of information on some of the history of MAS. And in fact, it did. But the first reaction I had when I flipped the book open, I just thought it was a ledger book. And then I see this beautiful engraved cover and immediately piqued my interest. And John, if you would go to the next slide. There was a first couple of pages in the book was a 2-page beautifully penned short history of MAS, and the very first entry in the book was written by Karl Fosmak, the president at the time, on November 17th, 1985, and he makes the first official entry in the book after that beautifully 2-page history of MAS, and he says the book itself was donated to MAS by Leroy Yana from his collection of antiques for use as a logbook for the new quote-unquote astronomy building at YRS. And Carl states he took the book to grim book binding to be repaired and cleaned and engraved. So that explains the engraving on the front of the antique book. And he comments on the book's antiquity. He kids a little bit in this statement about it almost being as old as Edmund Halley. I don't think the book goes back to the 1600s, but I'm sure it is a fairly old book. And this is immediately followed by an entry by Leroy Yana saying how pleased he is to be associated with such a, quote, ambitious group of people. So we are an ambitious group of people, guys. And he goes on to say he is pleased with the gift of the research site, and he is so greatly appreciated how it is fulfilling his lifelong dream. And he signs it. And if you look at the signature there in the second entry, it's a signature with a flourish. I just thought that was really a beautiful start to this book. So the book actually starts in 1985 when we moved into YRS, and I just wanted to point that out. Go on to the next slide. As we were going through this, we were trying to, oh, and by the way, we did image all of the, and we have digital images of all the pages in the book. But talking about the timeliness of doing this type of research, one of the first people that ever talked to me about MAS and talked to myself and Carol was a person that lived not too far from us when we lived in the town of Oregon, and his name was Ian Crenell. And when we were embarking on this idea of trying to search for old members and get some history, I remember that Ian was the one that approached me with one of the newsletters, and he says, oh yeah, you should look into this group and might be interested in it. And it wasn't until several years later when I got telescoped and we moved out to Brooklyn that I actually got involved in it. But my first thought was, well, I'll contact Ian and I'll be glad to interview him. I found out that literally 2 weeks prior to trying to initiate this research, he had passed away. which tells you a little bit about the criticality of trying to do this type of research and get old members' comments while they're still living. It was a shame that we missed him. In his obituary, by the way, he does talk about his love for astronomy. I know that Ian was involved in the distribution of the newsletter back sometime in the 80s and 90s, I believe. But I didn't really get a chance to talk to him more about it. But John, I'll let you go on from there and get into Ed's timeline.
Okay, we're going to go over to Dan.
Or Dan.
Okay, go ahead, John. Next slide.
Should be up. Oh, next. Got it. Okay.
So these are some of the places we've been finding information besides obituaries. Club records, we've got, Jurgen's got 2 boxes of club records. I don't know. We've got lots of meeting announcements. We've got newsletters and websites and old receipts. We're beginning to collect photos. So go ahead. Jurgen ran off this list of what we've collected on Google Drive. The biggest thing seems to be Kevin's logbook photos. So there's 150 photos of double-page pictures of the book. The next one is my scans of checkbook registers and treasurer's ledgers and a few other things from treasurer days. We've got a long collection of newsletters. We're just beginning to collect photos. We've got over probably 400 newspaper clippings, and then the rest is various other odds and ends. Go ahead. So about 10 years ago, I tried to make a list of all the officers of the club, and I did okay until the early 90s, and then I ran out of information. Until Jim Lattice gave us some old membership lists from the 30s and 40s. This is from 1940. And right there were some new officer names. So I got to add some old names to my spreadsheet. And when I was done, it was still more than half empty, but we've been able to add quite a few names since then. So I think it's going to be well worthwhile to have a list of the officers over the years. Go ahead. So another strange place where information came from. Every year we have to send this non-stock corporation report to the state telling them who our officers are. And Jurgen pointed out that every year this provides a list of the club officers. And we have these from the mid-'80s up to the present, except for a hiatus for a while. So these provided a check that we didn't have much information for in the 80s anyway. Go ahead. We have a lot of old mimeographed meeting announcements, and later they were postcards. Some of you may have gotten postcards in the early days. This one, for example, tells us who the secretary was at the time, tells us dues were $5, and has the, oh, this is from September of 1970. And it says that they have the problem of finding a meeting place for future meetings, because this was just 3 weeks after the Sterling Hall bombing. Okay, go ahead. John gathered probably close to 400 newspaper clippings, and we've been OCRing them, so we now have a searchable list of what's in them. Still a little more to do, but it's been pretty useful. And this is where we got most of our early information. Okay. When I was treasurer, I scanned all the checkbook registers from 1970 to 2015. So we have 45 years of financial records. And they've been pretty useful for finding dates and names and such. This one says Cubic Structures, Inc., new building, $3,500. This is the company that built the clubhouse. This was February of '85. Okay, go ahead. So before there were spreadsheets, treasurers kept their information in ledger books. This is Eric Thedes from the 70s.
Dan, can I interject a moment?
Yes.
I just wanted to say that buried in the records, we actually have all the individual receipts that go into this, which makes a bit of interesting reading. It's a bit of a mess to Xerox them, but we have the individual receipts and all the vendors that participated in all of that.
Are you speaking about the building of the
building
clubhouse?
And all the maintenance that went into it? Yes.
Yes. I might have scanned those back in the time. I'll have to check through.
Yeah, I've got some scanned in, but that's we'll take that offline.
Good. Okay. So anyway, Jurgen transcribed this book. It's about 20 pages long. And then I went through and pulled out all the dues payments. And I managed to make 3 membership lists for 74, 75, and 76, ones that we didn't have before. So that's been useful. And there may still be more information in this book. Go ahead. Then after Eric, Paul Fritchell and Joe Keyes kept a longer journal book. This one's 80 pages long. Here's an entry from 1983 that says, Ken Nordsiek was the speaker at the October meeting and was paid the princely sum of $15. So I went through this book and pulled out all the dues payments and managed to make 6 or 7 new membership lists for the late 70s and on up to 86. So we're pretty good for the 70s and 80s now. 90s a little weaker. And then after that, the era of spreadsheets, and we have pretty much complete records. Okay, go ahead.
Just Dan, just to give people an idea, I don't know if everybody appreciates how much work it is to go through checkbook register page after page after page, reconstructing a membership list based upon dues payments. That's a lot of work. And you did that for 8 to 10 separate membership lists over those years. Appreciate it.
Okay. This is one of the YRS logbook entries from 1996. Rod Helt and Richard Greiner paint the final finish coat on the Doc G, Deo Gratis. So a lot of good stuff in there. We hope that eventually you'll go back and find your first visit to YRS. Okay. So newsletters have been very helpful. This is not the first newsletter we have, but it's the first one called Capital Skies. The one before this has no name, and they're issuing a challenge to name this newsletter. So this is from November of '88. It tells us that the meeting was going to be at Union South. Just off the bottom of the picture, it lists the officers. Let's see, what else? Oh, it says that the newsletters were going to be monthly. And that seemed pretty ambitious to me. So I went back and checked the checkbook registers. And sure enough, in 1989, the year after this, there are 12 payments for newsletter expenses every month. So they actually did manage a monthly newsletter, and I think into 1990. But by 1991, I think printing and postage costs and just the effort had caught up with them, and they went to quarterly newsletters. And I hope you are appreciating those gorgeous graphics. Okay. The Wayback Machine pulled up this early website. This is actually our second attempt at a website. Windwhacker and I put this together. I have some old emails that said that Win brought in the nice graphic at the top of the Oscar Mayer Observatory. This was, what's the word, hosted at the Space Astronomy Laboratory. I think maybe Bob Bless was involved and possibly Jim Lattice, but I'm not sure. So this is.
I was going to say the graphic there, I think, was from a history of the MAS that had been printed out at one point, a brief early history.
Okay.
Yeah, that graphic had been used on a couple of earlier newsletters in the 70s, and it is reproduced on the top of that history document that we're going to talk about a little bit later.
Okay. So this website lasted from 96 to 99. And then next slide. This is our first, I guess we'd call it modern website. Bruce Brinkerhoff purchased and donated our domain name, madisonastro.org, and put up this website. At the top, you can see that this is the little bars are the times that the Wayback Machine grabbed copies of this website. And the red bar at the left means it's the earliest one that it managed to find. Yeah, there's the pointer, John. Unfortunately, we don't have any of the other pages, only the front page. But I actually found this in my old files, so we might be able to get a little more. Go ahead. Then this is Mike McDowell's redesign of the website. This is the earliest Mike McDowell I could find from September of 2000. He says, "Hi, I'm Mike McDowell, and this news page has one news article on it, so it's pretty early." So Mike did this for a bit over a year, I think. And then in October of 2001, there was a notice that they were looking for a new webmaster. Go ahead. So this is my redesign. I didn't change it very much, but, and this is pretty early too, February of 2002. And there are two news articles here. And I continued until 2018. Next slide. This is Jeff Shockler's latest design of the website. He started in December of 2018 and is continuing today. And I think when we put all of the all of the websites together, we have about 20 years of meeting announcements. And then when we add in newsletters, we go back another 10 years. And with those little meeting announcement slips, we can go back to the 60s and 70s. And after that, we depend on newspaper clippings. So, John, I think it's back to you.
So Dan and I are going to talk about some key MAS locations next, and we're going to talk about meeting places first, all the various places that MAS has used as a meeting location. And so we've got a timeline along the bottom there spanning the history of the group. The first recorded meeting place announcements were in the Madison Vocational School and the Madison General Hospital in the mid-30s. Two of our founding members were responsible for those. John English was a teacher at the vocational school. He taught chemistry. And Jack Supernaw was a physician, a surgeon in Madison, and he most likely practiced at Madison General Hospital. So when you don't have your own meeting place, you get a conference room at work, evidently, and that's what they did back in the day. So many of the early announcements that you'll see for those first couple of years of meetings were in rooms at the vocational school, the general hospital, or in a couple cases, the forest products laboratories. We do know of one early member, at least, Art Koster, whose name many of you may recognize. Art spent his whole career working as a scientist at the Forest Products Lab, but as far as we know, Art was not an early member. Art was not yet around in the 30s, so we don't know if there was somebody else who was responsible for getting us a meeting room at the Forest Products Lab, or if maybe that information comes from later after Art joined the club, and we don't know exactly when Art joined the club. But anyway, the Forest Products Lab was also used. Now, at some point, the club began meeting at Washburn Observatory, mostly as a result of this guy. This is Dr. Charles Morris Huffer. Dr. Huffer figures very, very prominently in the history of the club. Dr. Huffer is certainly one of the founding members of the club, and we're going to come back a little bit later and talk more about his role. But the story goes that in Huffer's involvement with the club, he was the second professor of astronomy after Joel Stebbins, and for many years the department was just Joel Stebbins and Charles Huffer. Huffer offered the club the use of the Washburn Observatory classroom to meet. And for those of you who know your Washburn history, when Washburn was built in the 1880s, the charter of the building, dictated that it had to be used for public outreach. And so in the charter, they put the first and third Wednesdays of every month shall be devoted to public outreach. And Huffer, of course, knew this, and Huffer said, well, why don't you use the observatory on the second and fourth Wednesdays, because nobody's using it on those evenings. And so when the club initially began meeting, it met on the second or fourth Wednesday of the month at Washburn Observatory. And as you can see from the timeline there, that meeting, that run of meetings at the Washburn Observatory ran from the 30s right up until 1960. And the reason that it stopped in 1960 was because in 1960, the astronomy department moved out of Washburn and moved into the newly constructed Sterling Hall. And so the MAS moved with them, and MAS met on a classroom up on the 6th floor of Sterling Hall for virtually the entire decade of the 1960s. Dan mentioned that there was an issue in 1970 that began to infringe, and so you'll see this club announcement from May of 1970 indicates a canceled meeting due to the unquiet state of the university campus. So we know that dissent was brewing even in May of that year. They had to cancel a meeting. And then the announcement that you already saw in September, they said, among other things, we will be discussing the problem of finding a meeting place for future meetings, because they knew Sterling Hall was going to be closed for a while. And of course it was, as the building was completely renovated in light of the bombing. So in 1970, the club was farming around for a place to meet. We don't have all the records. We have incomplete records from the 70s, but we know that in the early 70s, the club met at Luther Memorial Church for at least a couple of years, maybe several years. We're not sure how long, mostly in the early 70s. And in the later 70s, many meetings were held in the old Union South building. And so we have records of meetings and indications of meetings held in both of those locations in the early and then in the late 70s. For the decade of the 1980s, the club moved out to Lacey Road. At this point, the observatory was out there. The Oscar Mayer Observatory was in use by that time, well before that time, as a matter of fact. And this was a convenient meeting place because of its proximity to the Oscar Mayer Observatory. So people could meet, come to a meeting, and after the meeting was over, if it was dark, they could literally walk over to the observatory, more likely drive, but it was close enough that they could walk. The other bank building that was in use later in the 80s and into the 90s was the M&I Bank of Jamestown on Verona Road. And this is a contemporary picture of that building. So the club met in those two consecutive bank locations for most of the 1980s and into the 1990s. Beginning around, I don't know the exact year, but sometime in the early 90s, former member Bob Shannon was a science teacher at Edgewood High School, and Bob offered both his classroom and other meeting places at Edgewood. My first meeting in 1997 was in the library at Edgewood High School, so that's my first recollection of going to an MAS meeting. At that time, there was a new organization in town as of about 1990 or 91 called Space Place. And not the original director, but the new director of Space Place in about 91 was Jim Lattice. Jim Lattice joined the club, was a member of the club, and Jim embarrassingly says that he participated in several discussions as people were casting about at those Edgewood meetings for another location to meet, when Jim had one of those, facepalm moments and said, well, you guys should meet at Space Place. And so sometime in the early 90s, MAS moved permanently to the old Space Place in the Ponderosa building at 1605 Park Street. And that's the bulk of my formative years in the club were meeting there. And in fact, in that picture on the right, this is one of the early telescope and binocular fairs. I am pretty sure that that is me looking at somebody looking at something at one of those early telescope and binocular fairs. So we met at Space Place until Space Place moved into its new digs. And in 2005, the club moved with Space Place into our current meeting place there in the Villager Mall at 2300 South Park, where we still meet today.
And John, just as a side note, for those who might be interested, before Space Place moved into that the lower level of that 2300 South Park Street, that was the Wisconsin Physicians Service TRICARE operations, of which I was in charge of. And that lower level was one big bay area, the entire lower level. And we had probably about 250 employees that were packed in down there, had problems finding parking places for them in there. And then we ended up leaving that location. And that's when Space Place came in and walled it off. And the Space Place itself used to be our old mailroom and our meeting room there. If you remember the blue trim on that, that's WPS blue.
Very good.
Dan,
All right.
Dan, I wanted to ask, you must have 10 years of airtight records for membership and money for the club from Mary's term as treasurer, don't you?
Yes,
Yeah, good. I was going to say, because
and I passed those on to Jurgen.
Yeah, good, because we should be good on that anyway. I wanted to get that clear.
I'm working my way through those. I have those.
The one lacuna we have is that second there the old ledger book refers to a second ledger book, but we don't have it. So there's from 86 through the 90s, we're missing those records.
You think Joe has it?
I don't know. We did talk to Joe. We did do some emailing with him,
Yeah.
and he doesn't think so. But
Well,
John might want to go back and ask again.
Happy to. Yeah, Joe swears he passed everything on to the secretary who came after him. So, but you know, you never know what you're going to find in the top shelf of the closet or the basement. So we'll keep on digging.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Dr. Mary.
This is Jurgen. Have we talked to do we know where all the secretary records are and where all the president records are and all the VP records are?
I have not asked those specific questions. I asked the general question of everybody that I talked to about the question of documents, records, folders, briefcases, whatever. And so, yeah, everybody gets a pretty good interrogation on that question. And pretty much everybody says that, they passed on what they had when they left the office to the person who followed them.
I guess I could add that Dave Odell gave me his secretary records in 2015, I think. And I have those, and I think I probably passed them on to Jurgen. If not, I will. The CD that Dave gave me is right here on the shelf. I can see it. So that will get passed along. And I guess we're waiting for others to get collected together, and then they'll be passed along too.
Have a chat with Mary. You'd be talking to about 45 years of experience. So
Okay.
she'll tell you, yeah.
For those curious about the records question, here's what we believe is still outstanding that we have yet to get our hands on. Doris Coster is still alive, and Doris is very excited about this project and says that she has boxes of Art's old stuff, much of which we believe is just that. It's Art's old stuff, a lot of his personal observing records of the buildings that he built. But we believe that, there's probably a lot of MAS stuff mixed in with what Art has. We are currently on a kind of a COVID wait period before we get our hands on Doris's stuff, but Doris is very excited to participate in this. I've also been in touch with Sue Mansky. Sue says that she has at least a couple, maybe more, of Bob's old boxes. Bob sounds like he was a terminal pack rat, and we have no idea what might be there. Sue thinks that a lot of it is pretty useless stuff, like one use only star charts for occultations, grazes, and that kind of stuff. But again, she believes that there's probably a lot of MAS stuff left in those boxes. And though Dave Weir denies it, I still believe that Dave Weir has boxes in his basement. And Dave knows that as soon as COVID is over, I'm going to be knocking on his door with a search warrant. And Dave and I are going to go down to his basement together. We're going to go through some stuff. So those are the three locations that I still hold out hope for. And as always, anybody listening to this right now is a potential suspect in this crime. You may have a box in your closet that you have completely forgotten about. And if you ever find it, we want to know about it. So, check those closets, basements, garages, and other dusty places.
I want to take the opportunity to put on record that Sue Mansky designed our logo. The cloud-like typography across the moon.
Yeah, the one we still
I think it's kind of nice, and I want you to know that she did that, so it doesn't get lost.
He also got somewhat upset when some changes were made to the line proportions for, things like T-shirts or something like that.
Yeah, that's right.
She was very proprietary about the exact format of it.
You're right.
I took a little looser view of it that, depending on where it was appearing, you might want to make some slight adjustments.
Speaking of which, Wayne, we're looking
put
at
them nice, and somebody elevated them on some things. You're right, Lynn. So the good ones are, my opinion, but she did that, and I want her to have credit for it.
Okay, we're going to move along to observing locations, and Dan, you're going to do this.
John, I just wanted to ask: have you talked to Carson Jannet at all?
Yes.
You have, okay.
Yeah, still working on Carson. Carson's a work in progress.
You got his number?
Records at all?
You got his number.
I got his number, Tim, yes.
Okay,
Thank you for your call back, but I already got it.
all right.
Dan,
Okay, advance the slide. So the first recorded observing site that we've read about is the Monona Golf Course. They were there watching meteors, and not just watching them, but Huffer wanted to calculate the orbits of the particles. And so he had the Madison group and the Milwaukee group watching the same shooting stars, timing them, and figuring out where they went from start to finish. And he put that together and worked out some of the orbits of these particles. So that's pretty interesting. Mostly we just go out to ooh and ah over meteors now. Early on, there was some talk of building a public telescope at the Monona Golf Course. The mayor of Madison approved building I guess, an observatory building there. And the society had plans for how big was it? 15-inch, but more practically, probably a 10-inch reflector. But as far as we know, it never got done because they got invited over to Washburn and they had use of the 15.6-inch refractor there. So I think they never got back to the golf course. Go ahead. We also have a mention that they met at the Madison Reservoir. So if you're not familiar with this, there's a 6 million gallon concrete tank under that grassy patch in the middle of the photograph. And just to orient, that's Speedway in the lower right, the angle street, and Mineral Point Road is just off the bottom of the picture. And the reservoir is on Glenway Street. Yeah, that one. And this thing is still there. They drained it some years ago and checked it, and it's still in pretty good shape. So the club would go there, I guess, because...
Actually, Dan, they actually rebuilt it a couple of years ago.
Oh, they rebuilt it.
It's
Okay.
fully functional. It's under observation 24 hours a day, the whole bit. But it's fully functional. It actually is right on the border between two water zones here in Madison.
Oh, okay.
I should point out that Ed Bailey, who was in charge of the Nine Springs sewage treatment plant, water chemist, chief water chemist for the city, lived in that neighborhood. And that may be one reason why that was selected as a site.
I live a block and a half from there.
Okay. And apparently about this time, Midvale Boulevard was the western edge of the city on the frontier. So this was getting out of the city to observe at. Yeah, we have a newspaper clipping that says 12 members gathered at the city reservoir. So.
It's also just about the highest point in the city.
Oh, it is.
Yeah. The
Okay.
police tower is right next to it, the radio tower.
Ah,
There's some political stories about the rebuilding of that tower about 20 years ago. Cost a certain mayor an election, I think.
ah.
I live just a couple blocks down the hill from that towards University.
So you were aware of the reservoir, Tim?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I had to look it up. There's a good article on the city website, which we will probably link to eventually.
Oh, one comment I want to make about this picture, it's kind of interesting. Just to the west, to the left of the reservoir, there's a residential area called Sunset Hills. And at the time, 1939, there was nothing built there. That was all wild. If there was anything developed at all, it would have been to the right of that. The subdivision I'm in actually was built starting in about 1948.
Okay.
So it would have been very nice viewing to the west.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just to the south of Hoyt Park.
Yep.
White's right there.
Yeah. There's a
Yeah, we
nice
had some.
overlook.
Go ahead.
Yeah, where all the high school kids went to park at night.
And a couple of years ago, they started smoking things in the park also.
Oh,
We had some early picnics recorded at Hoyt Park too.
oh yeah.
And
Yeah.
the overlook there at the time, again, 1939, when Midvale was the western boundary of the city, you would have had beautiful views out to the west with very
Yes.
little interference.
Yeah, right there was the Owen Parkway area. So the overlook would be right about there where you look over what's now Hilldale area.
Right. Mhm.
Yeah.
Ready, Dan?
All right, go ahead. So, observing move to Washburn. This is a 1880s engraving. You see the student observatory just near Washburn. We actually have photos of cows just a couple of hundred yards from Washburn. And behind it, going down to the lake, was all orchards. And right next to the student observatory was a very nice toboggan run for the winter. But I guess it succumbed to road building and dormitory building. Okay.
During the late 60s, the tradition of tobogganing was carried on by students taking plastic trays from the cafeteria and sliding down the hill in that area.
Actually, it also went on and sliding down from Baskin Hill to Park Street. And that could be quite a thing. You'd get down to the bottom and guess what? There was a couple foot drop as they went down to the sidewalk and then down to Park Street itself. And trays from the Memorial Union, the big waiter trays, the big oblong aluminum ones, those got stolen at a pretty good rate and ended up down on Park Street.
I know in the 40s and 50s, they built a ski jump on Bascom Hill that went down, ended up out on the ice of Mendota. And that was exciting, but they lost the ability to do that when they built the lake lab down there below. Too bad. It was fun sport for students, ski jumping. My cousins did that, the Jesslins, and they became good scientists. How does that work, Jurgen? The big toboggan slides in the Madison Park were put up courtesy of Oscar Mayer, by the way, when they made ice. And that's how they went away when Oscar Mayer quit making ice. Those are exciting too. They had one in Hoyt Park.
Yeah, I remember going down that as a kid.
Yeah. On a good cold night, they hit 60 miles an hour coming down that tower.
Oh.
Yeah.
It was scary.
Picture you have here, somewhere in the background, you can't really see it. It's kind of hidden by the observatory. There was the tent colony, which existed on campus until the late 1940s, actually into the early 50s, where students would put up tents and actually go to school, which actually was on the grounds of an old Indian camping ground.
Yeah. I remember those tents even out there by Picnic Point.
Yep.
They still had them out there even into the 60s. I had a friend that did summer school in the tent out there.
Dan, we should move on.
Yep.
Okay.
All related.
Next. All right, so on the left, there's a more modern view of the student observatory, one of those newfangled horseless carriages. At the top is a letter from Oscar Mayer, who was apparently working with the club. I don't know the whole story, but possibly to renovate the student observatory. And then in 1960, when the legislature authorized the university to give away the student observatory, Oscar Mayer, oh, and by the way, give it not to MAS, but to the junior section of MAS, which became the Explorer Post. So in 1960, Oscar Mayer paid to have the dome lifted off and the building cut in two, and it was trucked over to Fish Hatchery Road. Next slide.
Well, just before we go, Dan, the backstory to that letter by Oscar Mayer is in 1954, Oscar Mayer's first donation to the club was the Steinheil refractor, this very nice refracting telescope, which he donated to the club in 54 with the understanding that the club needed to permanently mount it. This isn't the kind of telescope that you could just keep on getting out, putting away and getting out. And so he donated the telescope and I think $1,500 for the building of an observatory to house it. And so that's his question in 54 is how far along did the Astronomical Society get this summer with the little observatory, meaning someplace to keep the Steinheil. And then it was about 6 years later when the university donated the building to the Junior Society that Oscar Mayer stepped in again and wrote a check to pay for the moving. Which is
Okay.
$1,500 in those days was real money.
Yeah.
All right, so the building is still on the Bjorkston Laboratories property, just east of Fish Hatchery Road.
Well, it's
see it there.
now owned by, well, basically the land is owned by Promega.
Okay,
They have that land and a whole bunch of other land, as you know, near that area as well.
I'm not sure of the whole story, but Bjorkston created an early research park in the area.
That's right.
So that's probably why some of those pharmaceutical companies are there today.
Well, the type of research he was doing really did not relate to the molecular biology sorts of things that Promega does. Bjorkston did a lot of work in testing and developing a number of more like metal alloys, and they developed the shaft that was used in for scrambling radar in World War II. So they had quite a bit in the way of research success. The Promega came along afterwards, and actually Bjorkston himself wound up eventually the organization was just down to him and his secretary, and he joined up with another group of engineers that had come up from a company called Bit 7 in Chicago to create an annex here in Madison called Bit 7, and they combined the two. They thought his particular branch of research, they were primarily electronics, but the stuff that he did would fit in well with the organization, and they became Bjorkston Bit 7, which eventually is now called BB7, which is the company I'm currently employed by.
We also learned just recently that that Promega is talking about doing some restoration of the observatory too.
They have already done that. I actually was called into a meeting several years back, along with Jim Lattice, They were interested in some of the history of the building, and they wanted to sort of restore it, not to its original condition when it was sitting on the campus, obviously, but they wanted to put it together as something that could be used as sort of a public education facility on occasions. And they have, as far as I know, they've completed that project pretty much.
I was last there about a year ago. This is Lawrence, and yeah, the renovation was complete then, and we just installed the Paramount with the 16-inch Cassegrain telescope and a Takahashi piggyback scope, and they've got the whole thing operated from a computer in what was the warming room, but which now looks like a posh library that would rival the library in Washburn. So the whole interior of the building just is very nice, and it looks like a museum and an art gallery in there now.
And it was the building was in pretty sad shape when we went to tour it when I was out there visiting Promega, and so a considerable amount of funds and employee time was sunk into that. Bill Linton, the president of Promega, apparently the first place building he worked on the campus was basically next to the observatory, and he recalled looking at it a lot when he was starting up the company, and it just became a pet project of his.
When you consider the history of what that building has been through over the years, it's not surprising to hear how sad a shape it was in 2016, 2017, or whenever that project started. I haven't seen the renovation, but I've heard that the interior is fabulous.
I was out there one day with Lawrence, and it really is. It is very nice. One other thing, the records that go back to the 1970s and 80s, you find letters from Bjorkston to the MAS, and really what he was doing was trading a free membership for free parking for the observatory out there.
Yeah, he continued to own the land, and he just gave permission for the society to have the observatory there. One concession he did make is that there was a security light that was on the corner of one of the buildings that was nearby there, and he did allow us to have a key to turn it off so that people could observe from there without that interference, if they promised to turn the light back on when people had left.
Okay. It occurred to me yesterday that this building will soon be 140 years old.
God.
It seems to go back to about 1881.
It's quite venerable, yes.
Yeah.
It was put up not that long after Washburn itself, really.
Okay.
Just another quick anecdote. We know that the club had a logbook in the Oscar Mayer Observatory for the years that they observed out there. We do not have that logbook. So again, all you old timers, get down to your basements and look around. What are you sitting in front of your computer for?
Well, it's not something I would have taken, because I left Madison when that observatory was still technically in use. So somebody else must have been responsible in the final clearing out of things from the observatory there before they turned the observatory building over to Fitchburg, which is what had happened.
Okay. We should probably go ahead because John's got another story to tell. So light pollution caught up with Fitchburg, and they began looking around for a new place. And in 1984, Leroy Yana donated not quite an acre of land on Kelly Road. On the left, you see a couple of pictures of YRS from 1991, when it was just 6 years old. So the clubhouse still had its Saturn logo. The original AKO was still there. And between them, you see empty space, because the Doc G was still 5 years in the future. On the other picture, you can see the old telephone booth roll-off that housed the 17-inch Dob. And it lasted until, I guess, the wind blew it over in a storm. And it was replaced by the tin shed. And now time has replaced the tin shed too. And in the lower left of that same picture, John, the KMO is now gone off to a new home. And the DGRO was not there yet. This was a planning drawing for where to put it. So, and who knows, there probably soon you'll see some new concrete pads and such there. So who knows
KMO,
what, pardon?
I just wanted to say the KMO, we were still paying insurance on that until Tom knocked it off the insurance thing a couple of years ago. And all that there is the concrete stub.
Yes, which you can drive into at night if you're not careful.
But at least it was insured.
Yeah.
Okay.
Was it insured for collision?
All right. So, John, I think it's back to you.
So I just wanted to go over a couple of other things that we've been working on. We've been interviewing members. To date, we have completed 27 interviews. 12 more interviews are either already in process or scheduled to begin. We have been favoring members on the upper end of the time scale, should I say. So we've been lucky enough to have 5 members from the 1950s. Think about that. After this car goes by on Old Sock Road. What is going on? Motorcycles.
Oh,
We have talked with 5 club members who were still around when Dr. Huffer was here, which is just astounding and extraordinary to me. 6 members from the 1960s, some of whom are sitting in on this virtual meeting with us right now, and 8 members from the 1970s. And as you would expect, as we get up into the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, the number of available people in that interview pool grows significantly. So we are starting out with the most sensitive end of the timeline. The information that has come from those interviews is just amazing. And it's something that you'll be able to read more about when the history committee actually puts together some of the document that we're planning. But there's some really good stories from the Junior Society. There's some really good stories from the Explorer Scouts and from other aspects of what was going on in the club back in the 50s and 60s. So just fascinating stuff. Dan already mentioned the newsletter, but I wanted to show you our newsletter coverage. It looks like this. We're really well covered for the 1990s to the current time. In fact, I would say we have every single issue of the newsletter that was published probably post 1993 or 94. There are a couple of sketchy periods in the early 90s that we're not sure about. But when you go back to the 80s and the 70s, that's really sad. We know that there were more newsletters, but we have not yet been able to get our hands on them. And again, we're hopeful that there's still some out there that will be found. We believe that there was some newsletter activity earlier. It was not easy to do newsletters in the pre-PC days. But again,
especially the pre-Xerox days, back when you either had to have things printed or use mimeography.
Yeah. So anyway, we're hopeful that we're going to find more newsletters. The newspaper archives was really the pleasant surprise. And in retrospect, it probably shouldn't have been that big of a surprise. In the heyday of newspapers, the newspaper was truly the virtual town square. If you went over to a neighbor's house for a nice dinner on a Friday night, somebody probably phoned it into the paper and it would appear in the society section that weekend that Windwhacker and wife were joined by Kevin Santulis and family for a very nice oyster dinner on Friday night. So, you know, a lot of information was in the newspaper. And when you get a society or a club like ours, and you get somebody who is paying attention to informing the newspaper of meetings, there was coverage. We had a banquet, it was covered. We had an election, they announced it before the election, and they ran a piece after the election to say who was elected. So we got some good board member information. As you get into the 1990s, the 2000s, there's still decent coverage there, but it really changes in character quite a bit. A lot of it was dependent upon who in the society was taking on that role of being the liaison with the newspaper and how active were they in doing that. We had quite a few feature articles. There were quite a few good science journalists for the State Journal and the Cap Times over the years. And so MAS got some good coverage. We have almost all of that. Speaking of newspaper coverage, I want to get into a little bit. We're going to end with this, but I want to tell you a little bit of the story of what we've been able to learn about the earliest days of the club. And I believe that most of the information that we've gathered is new information, because in previous attempts, and I'll point back at 1991, in 91, the club celebrated its 60th anniversary. As far as I've been able to determine, no part of that celebration involved anybody really attempting to gather historical documents and write a history or even tell a history of the club. We can't find anything. So I'm going to share with you some of what we found. I'm going to go through this rather quickly. Some of this, I apologize in advance, is reading. There's no way to put any of this up except to put some text on the screen, and I'm embarrassed to read it to you, but I'm going to read it to you. I'm going to go through it quickly, though. If you have any questions or comments, feel free. We got a tap, tap, tap going on. If anybody is tapping, either mute yourself or control that tapping. Dr. Huffer came back. He retired in 1961. In 1977, he had retired from his second career at San Diego State University. He came back to Madison, and one of the things that he did is Dr. Huffer set for an oral history interview. Oral histories are very, very common practice of institutions to preserve their history. So Dr. Huffer sat for an interview. It was 2 hours and 13 minutes. We have the whole transcript. We even had the audio of this. Some of you will recall that I shared the audio, portions of the audio, with the Facebook group a few weeks ago. In this oral history interview, which again goes on for more than 2 hours, this is just fascinating to me. At the 27-minute mark, so Dr. Huffer has been talking to his interviewer, who is a woman named Miss Taylor. He's been talking to her for nearly a half an hour. And at that 27-minute mark, Dr. Huffer says, well, I have to talk about the Madison Astronomical Society. Unprompted, she did not ask him. In fact, he said to her, have you ever heard of that? And Miss Taylor says, I've heard of it, but that's about the extent of my information. She didn't know anything about the MAS. So Dr. Huffer went on, and this is what he said. This was his first of a couple major statements about the club. Keep in mind, this is 1977. This is 16 years after his retirement. And this is, do the math for me, 47 years after the presumptive founding of the club. Well, there was a group of people that were going to make telescopes, grind lenses, mirrors for telescopes. Well, they finally contacted me, and we advised them to use the observatory classroom on Wednesday night when it wasn't being used, and we formed the Madison Astronomical Society. I think we had, I don't know, 30 or 40 members. It was partly the result of an evening extension non-credit course that I gave in astronomy. Just elementary descriptive astronomy was sponsored by the Department of the Extension Division of the university. These two classes form the nucleus of the Madison Astronomical Society, which is still going, but it's not the same as it used to be. There were more younger people. He's saying this after coming back to Madison after 16 years of being away, and came back to a meeting, and obviously a lot of the old timers that he knew were gone. There is a lot of information in this paragraph about the history of the club. First of all, the University of Wisconsin Extension was a thing in those days, and they did the same thing then that they do now. They provide courses for non-students. If you're a member of the community and you want to take a class, the University Extension Program offers a lot of classes. Dr. Huffer taught an elementary descriptive astronomy class. We know quite a bit about it. He says down here, 2 classes. We don't know exactly what the second class is. I think he's probably just talking about 2 years of his extension class. He was a very popular teacher. He was a very popular lecturer. And I'm sure that his lectures in the extension class were also very popular. And he says that those students from his extension class form the nucleus of the Madison Astronomical Society. So some of the Madison residents who took his class ended up being probably founding members of MAS.
John?
Yeah,
John,
go ahead.
I'm wondering, have you tried to approach extension about getting any information from way back then? University's pretty bad at keeping those records, but
Extension doesn't have anything, but University Archives probably does. I have spoken with people at Archives who believe that they probably can track something down. It's not going to be easy, and it's going to require on-site digging through the archives. So I have the green light and a big welcome sign from them to come do it as soon as they're back open again. So that's one of my first stops once COVID restrictions lift, which starting next week, we might be back in business. So I'm hoping that the course, the dates of his courses and the student lists still exist, because comparing those lists to membership lists would be informative. So anyway, that was the first part of Huffer's statement. This is the second part. Taylor, his interviewer, says, now how did this group get interested in making lenses? Dr. Huffer replies, well, they weren't lenses. If I said lenses, and he did, I misspoke. They were mirrors for reflecting telescopes. I can't tell you exactly, but the nucleus of these 4 fellows, we'll come back to the 4, got together. I think they met in various places. One was with the Madison General Hospital. Dr. Supernall was the prime mover of that. And then they had a meeting out at the Forest Products Laboratory. Finally, came up to the observatory. I was secretary of the club for, I don't know, 25 years or something like that. He was. Dr. Huffer was the club secretary for about 25 years. Finally, I nominated myself to be president, and I was president for 1 year, just prior to his retirement. He served a year as president of the club. We had good times. We attended meetings. We always had a lecturer by somebody, usually yours truly, but I tried to get the members of the society to take part in that. When I left, why? It sort of went to pieces. All those people were getting old and had other things to do. So that's Dr. Huffer's coda for the group. When he left Madison, the group went to hell in a handbasket, according to Dr. Huffer. I don't think it quite shaped up that way, but I understand after his tenure with the group, after everything he did for the group probably wasn't the same after he left. So there is a lot of information. There's a lot in these 2 paragraphs. What you'll notice is not in these 2 paragraphs is any dates or any concrete information to attach to the timeline. We know that Huffer got his degree in 1926 and immediately joined the faculty. So Dr. Huffer was on the faculty from 1926-27 until he retired in 1961. We know that the group was formed sometime in the 1930s. So that leads me to our next document. Oh, first of all, it leads me to these 4 fellows. Who were the 4 fellows that he mentioned? That leads me to our next document. And I'm just going to call this document the 1930 to 1960 history. We don't know what else to call it other than the Madison Astronomical Society. This is the only written history of the club that we know of. This is the only one that we have. And as you can see, this copy was given to me by Dave Darling. When Dave joined the group, this is one of the things that the club mailed to him. We believe that it was written in the early 60s based upon internal evidence. We don't know exactly when it was written. The document itself is undated. It has no authorship claim. We don't know who wrote it. And no sources are identified. There's no bibliography. There's no footnotes. There are no, nothing. It's a prose 2-page statement. But we believe that it's based in fact, because there's a lot of internal and external validity. The writer of this document obviously knew what he or she was talking about. It's consistent with other things we know. It's consistent with other documents that we have. So I want to go into this a little bit, and I'm only going to look at that first paragraph. So we're just going to take a look at this paragraph of this document tonight, and then we're going to end. This paragraph reads, and this reads like a history. The earliest plans for the creation of an astronomical society in Madison can be traced back to October 1930. Very specific, right? When Mr. William R. Binney and Mr. John M. English discussed their common interest in lens grinding and observing, as well as the possibility of attracting other would-be astronomers to probe the mystery of the stellar world. Soon after, Dr. C.M. Huffer, a member of the astronomy department of the University of Wisconsin, who knew about Dr. Binney's hobby, was invited to dinner by Dr. J.S. Supernaw, a prominent Madison physician. The host, as it turned out, was also interested in amateur astronomy. Ideas were exchanged, and finally, early in 1931, the Madison Astronomical Society was actually launched through the combined efforts of these 4 pioneers and a few of their friends. That, in a nutshell, is the history of the club. When you talk to most people in Madison, in MAS, who have an opinion about the history of the club, whether they've read this document or not, what they will recount to you probably came from this document. This is the history of the club, for lack of any other history that exists, because as far as we know, or as far as we've discovered yet, no other history exists.
John?
Yeah.
One thing I just wanted to mention, if anybody wants to go out and look at the Wikipedia pages for the Milwaukee Astronomical Society, they will find that there is a mention on that Wikipedia page of the formation of that society, along with the Madison Astronomical Society and the Astronomical Society of Southern Illinois, which is mentioned in the document also, as the first astronomical societies in the country.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that trio that you just talked about. Madison MAS, Milwaukee MAS, and the Missouri Southern Illinois Astronomical Society. So we're going to come back to that in a minute. This document is the 1930 through 1960 history of the club. You can see why we chose those dates. The 1930 because of the express mention in that paragraph, and then the 31 formation of the club, and the fact that it ends around the 1960s through other evidence that you can read later in the document. But what we know is the identity of those 4 people. Dr. Huffer mentioned the 4 fellows, and if Dr. Huffer was referring to himself, the 4 fellows were Dr. Huffer, Dr. Supernaw, Mr. English, and Mr. Binney. We know a good bit, in fact, about Supernaw, English, and Binney. Obviously, we know a lot about Huffer. But I want to move now to a couple of newspaper articles, and this is where we're really going to end, because this is where it gets back to what do we know about the formation of the club. Was it 1930? Was it 1931? Or was it some other date? And how do you define the formation of the club? What do you use as your criteria when you're talking about the formation of a club? So here's the first article that I want to share with you. This is from the Wisconsin State Journal, January 13th, 1935. There was a hobby show taking place in Madison. A hobby show is just what you think. If you have a hobby, if you can imagine a hobby, sign up for a booth, come out and share your hobby with the public. So this was the Sunday, January 13th. The hobby show was the following Friday. So they're noticing people early. In this article, right there, that paragraph, I'm going to blow it up for you. Some of the outstanding exhibits will be the prize-winning Kluge canary birds of Mrs. Pearl Steinsberger, the telescopes of the Astronomy Club and John English, and the tropical fish display of the other MAS, the Madison Aquarium Society. So notice there the term Astronomy Club. This is the first occurrence of those 2 words in a Madison newspaper that we can find. Never before have the words Astronomy Club been used in the newspaper. January 13th, 1935. So that week, the Thursday paper comes out. State Journal runs another teaser for the hobby show. Don't miss the hobby show. There's the paragraph, blowed up. A pair of fish building a nest will be present as part of the exhibit of the Madison Aquarium Society. The parts and working of a telescope will be presented in still and active life by the Madison Astronomical Society. And there, on January 17th, 1935, the first time those three words appear in print, as far as we know, the Madison Astronomical Society. So when was the club formed? Was it in 1931 as the history, the untitled, unnamed history says, or was it in 1935? Well, 6 weeks later, now we're March 3rd, 1935, this article appears in the paper. Disregard the misspelling of Dr. Supernaw's name. They get it right in the body of the article. Dr. Supernaw heads Astronomical Society. And I will call your attention to the newly formed Madison Astronomical Society at a meeting of the amateur astronomers at the vocational school took place. So the newly formed Astronomical Society, March 1935. It goes on to say that they were also considering the formation of a junior club, which we know in fact happened. So the junior club was mentioned back this. And this again, they're talking about a meeting that is going to take place where the society will be formalized because it is now a newly formed group. The society is contemplating publishing a monthly paper for its members and others interested in scientific study. The junior club is mentioned. The society plans to cooperate with other astronomy clubs throughout the state, telescope observations, et cetera, et cetera. The group is cooperating with Beloit College, Reedsburg, Milwaukee, and Madison Astronomy Observatories in sending its reports to the Little Flower Harvard University Observatory. So they're going to meet Wednesday at the vocational school in room 140, the formation and adoption of a constitution with the express purpose of making this society a permanent organization will be discussed. So this appears to be a newspaper article documenting the formalization of the society. Now I know from some reading I've done that there still is, and there was in those days, maybe more so, there was a difference between a club and a society. A club was considered informal. If you wanted to be formal and have some clout and have some authority, you formed a society. Obviously, MAS became a society. So this group, they were writing a constitution and they had permanence in mind. And I dare say they succeeded. So in 1935, March, we have the first actual recounting of the formation of the society itself. It was mentioned 6 weeks before in the hobby club. So the name was certainly in the air. And we do know of astronomers meeting and doing things in the years leading up to 1935. We have some documentation of some of those founding members and some others. And I'm gonna talk about one of them in a minute. So this was March 3rd. Just 4 days later, on March 7th, another article in the State Journal. Astronomers talk, City Observatory, plan at meeting. So this is now after the meeting. A proposal for a municipal observatory in Madison was discussed Wednesday night by members of the Madison Astronomical Society at the vocational school. It was announced that Madison and Milwaukee are bidding for the editorship of the proposed National Astronomy publication. And this goes back to what we just talked about. The club was divided into two sections for meteoric observations. Leslie W. Ketchum was named the chairman of the West Group, and William Binney will head the East Side Group. Going back to that publication for a second, Milwaukee, Madison, and the Missouri Southern Illinois Astronomy Society actually did publish a journal for 2 years. We have both volumes. It was a very fancy, very incredibly well-produced journal. I think most of the credit goes to the Milwaukee Society, because the Milwaukee Society, by 1935, 1936, was a very sophisticated scientific organization. They were publishing their own newsletter. The journal that is being discussed here, that does exist, and we do have the copies of it, was obviously modeled after the Milwaukee Society's group. They ceased publication after 2 years, probably because of financial burdens. But if anybody's interested in seeing those, we have those. Going back to one more article, and then we're going to be done, and hopefully we can have some Q&A. July of 1935. Now we're skipping ahead from March to July. This article appeared, City Astronomers Present Speaker on WIBA Tonight. The Madison Astronomical Society will present its second speaker over WIBA at 6:30 tonight during the hobby hour, when Paula Berner will speak on astronomy as a hobby. Miss Berner, a Madison teacher, conducted the Watchers of the Sky program over WHA radio during the last school year. Now think about the timeline here for a second. This is July, the end of the school year, after the meeting in January and March that we just discussed. A year prior to that, Paula Berner was already on the radio doing a program called Watchers of the Sky. Paula Berner is an interesting person. Paula is not mentioned as a founder of the club. Those are all men. But Paula Berner is interesting. So I'm going to throw up a picture. This is Dr. Supernaw from his UW-Madison Senior Yearbook. This is Paula Berner from her lacrosse normal school, before UW lacrosse was a thing, 1924 yearbook picture. This is when she got her education degree. These men were undoubtedly centrally involved in the club. Most of them were married, and their wives were involved in the club. I'm sorry to say, most of the time when the wives were mentioned, they were serving tea and cookies to the men who were conducting the meeting. Paula Berner was cut from a different cloth. Not only was she on the radio a year before any of this happened, giving a program on the radio about astronomy, but subsequent to this, she was writing articles. 2 years, she wrote articles for the State Journal in astronomy, 1938, 37, 38, or 38, 39. Paula Berner was an interesting woman. I believe Paula was as much responsible for the early impetus of the club and the early operations of the club as any of the men. Fortunately, we found a lot of information, and I'm going to save all of it for a future meeting, because as Dan, Jurgen, and Kevin will tell you, I am obsessed with Paula Berner. She is a fascinating person. I had never heard of her, but she deserves attention, and I'm determined to see that she gets at least some of it. So we've got some really interesting Bernerology to go into the next time we get together and have a meeting like this. In the meantime, as discussed, we've got newspaper articles, we've got this astronomy publication that was published for a couple of years, we've got our club newsletters, we've got other stuff. We need to have a discussion as a club to how best make those available now for those of you who want to take a look at those things, and how to preserve them for future generations of club members and researchers, because I don't want anybody to have to go back and do what Dan did in Xeroxing and scanning, ledgers, and Kevin and photographing the logbook. We need to keep these things that we've got. What we've got is a great, if we never find another article to put in our library, we've got a great treasure trove of research or raw materials for people to research. We want to make sure that we preserve that on the club website, on some hosted website, I don't know, but we need to make sure that it sticks.
John?
Yeah.
Actually, the second paragraph is interesting of that last article. The society, organized by Professor John English of the vocational school and headed now by Supernaw, has a membership of more than 35 workers. Gives you an indication of the size.
Yep.
And also, but they say it's now headed by Supernaw. It sounds there's an implication there. It actually existed before Supernaw took over.
And you're just scratching the surface, Jurgen. I mean, there's so many implications, so many statements like that that are pregnant with potential meaning. And, for instance, with that, I believe that one way that we can help get to the bottom of some of that would be to get our hands on Dr. Huffer's extension course rosters. Did Mr. English take that course? Did Paula Berner take that course? Who else was in that course? How does Dr. Supernaw fit in? When did those people meet? If that meeting took place the way that it was described in the history document, Dr. Supernaw inviting Mr. Binney to dinner or whoever it was or whatever, those sound legitimate, but I want more documentary evidence if we can find it, because you're right. That is almost proof that in fact the club existed before the society was formally organized. So it's very, very pregnant with meaning.
John, my impression from going through all these, reading these documents as we're going through this history is that you're right. It comes down to what do you count as the formation of MAS, because I do believe there was a continuum. And that continuum, I think, from 1931 to 1935 consisted of a get-together of like-minded people that were interested in the science, to the formation of a club, and then the formation of a society that got it a little bit more respect and association with other astronomical societies. And one of the things that I would like to see come out of this at some point too is once we have a good feel for what we want to say, is I'd like to match the Milwaukee Astronomical Society's attempt at putting together a short history and get it on Wikipedia, so people, when they're looking up MAS, have at least a summary of what MAS's history is.
Yeah, agree. Before we end tonight, any other comments, questions, or anything on stuff that you've seen tonight?
I do have to compliment you on all the work that went into gathering this amount of information, because that's a lot of research, and especially getting down to the level of detail that you've drug up. Certainly there's things about the early society in there that none of us were aware of, at least in my time.
Turns out that COVID was useful for something.
Silver linings.
Well, guys, good job. I'm really impressed with what you've done. It's been a trying time for the club, given the virus and everything, and then to also have done the election remotely. You've met some new challenges here, and you've met them successfully. So if I'd be wearing my MAS hat, I take it off to you. Good job.
I'm sure the work isn't near being finished. You can go on, and you can come up with more questions.
I think there are all sorts of narratives that can come out of this, individual storylines, and I'm really looking forward to some of those. There's just a lot of history here. Well, hey, how's that? There's a lot of history here. But just the narrative stories, the development of YRS, the development of the Oscar Mayer Observatory, what people were interested in at different times in the club, who the movers and shakers were. Just a lot of interesting narratives here to be created.
Yeah, and one of the questions that arises is, what are we going to do with this information? How are we going to present this information? And what we kind of agreed upon at the outset was we're going to write a history, and we had kind of come up like with a 5,000 word ballpark, so a pretty significant, piece of writing. But what are we going to do with it? We'd love to publish it. Publishing is expensive. We'd love to get it printed. Printing is expensive. Of course, we can do something on, electronic media and the websites, and we'll certainly do that. to Kevin's point, to write a Wikipedia page, you have to be able to cite sources. We've got a lot of sources now that we can cite, and we'll have even more once the committee does some writing. But how, I just look at, because we've uncovered, the story of Paula Berner is just one story. There are many stories. Don't even get me started on the Explorer Scouts in the 1970s. Those were a couple of, those were kids who were passionate about astronomy and into high school shenanigans. And there are just oodles of great stories. The Junior Society that Wynn and Eric are familiar with, and from the 1960s. There is so much there that I frankly, I don't really know how to do it because there's so much. I have some ideas, but I'm open to ideas from other people in the club who might want to contribute, to some of the present proofreading and so forth and so on.
I was going to suggest, in terms of preservation, if you really want to make sure it's preserved, you might want to get in touch with the Wisconsin Historical Society.
Yeah.
And see about what they might be interested in terms of, obviously they'd probably be interested in whatever summary document, but whether they'd be interested in preserving any of the other materials that you've put together, because it's part of Wisconsin history.
It's also definitely.
I'm convinced that the state, because I've done research at the State Historical Society, 99% of their holdings are not digitized. You don't learn anything until you go and you start digging through the card catalog and pulling out boxes of photos and boxes of documents. I'm convinced that there's more stuff at the State Historical Society that we can both benefit from, as well as talk to them about preservation for the long term. Same with the UW archives.
They're not particularly interested in digitization.
John,
it's not very archival. It's a battle they've been struggling with for 40 years.
Yeah.
John, this is Jeff. I have an idea, depending on when we decide to celebrate the 90th anniversary of MAS. Let's say it's next year. I think there is an outlet for this. Our society is one of the oldest astronomical societies in the country. You've got incredible documentary evidence. You've got images that are associated with that documentary evidence. I think the target you should aim for that really merits this body of information and the history of the club is Sky and Telescope.
Yes.
That's where you should publish this.
Or astronomy.
I thought about that, Jeff.
Yeah.
And I have some experience with both Sky and Telescope and astronomy magazines. I know Dave Eicher pretty well. What I foresee is if we write, let's just say we write an article for Sky and Telescope that's 2,500 words. Sky and Telescope will publish 400 of those words with a picture.
Yep.
Maybe on the back page.
No, because I've seen 5-6 page articles with lots of images. That team that did the used astronomical evidence to relocate Caesar's landing site in England. This is the kind of article that is. This is a feature story. This is not a blurb, but it's how you write it. So you'd want to reach out to the editors to find out, how can we package this as a feature story? Because Sky and Telescope, it's got a lot of science, but there are tons of amateur astronomers who are members of societies that have deep history. And I think we could get a 5-6 page with images feature story in SkyTel for this.
Well, Jeff, if I was going to vote for your version of future history, I'd definitely vote for yours.
Yeah.
But we will make inquiries like that, because I've already thought of sending something off to both astronomy and Sky and Telescope.
Yeah.
To see it published as more than just that thoughts on the back page or whatever.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's not a one pager. It's so rich, as you mentioned, and it's so tied in to the history of astronomy at UW-Madison and the astronomy. There are so many linkages here that I think it would be a fascinating article.
Development of the hobby, the evolution of the hobby is
absolutely. Yeah, aim high.
And by the way, the idea about the Historical Society, I think, is also worthwhile. Even though that they may not have a lot of digitized old stuff, I'm sure they're digitizing a lot of stuff now. And they probably, as a result, they don't have an awful lot of limits on you in terms of what they will store in a digital form. So if we wanted to put together a complete history, I'll bet you 10 to 1 that they would be glad to take it in.
Especially digital.
They
It
like
doesn't
original.
take a lot of space to store it, as opposed to the space limitations for paper
The
documents.
problem with digital is that somebody has to shepherd the collection then, because the technology keeps turning over.
Yeah,
I've been
true.
down this road. I spend a lot of time in the archives. I know what I'm talking about.
Well, I understand that too, and I agree with you, Tim. The thing is, with some of the technologies on digital right now, they are non-proprietary. And I know this because of my experience with having to be in charge of records for a very large operation like WPS, where we have to keep records for the government. We had to deal with some of those conversions in the past of old digital records onto different storage media. But now that there is a move towards standardization of some of those digital patterns right now in terms of non-proprietary formats.
I know, but it isn't archival. I've had these discussions with them again and again and again, and they're looking at 100 years from now.
Tim, the more important point is that the State Historical Society is a good destination for us, both because they're a source and because they're a possible repository down the road at W Archives. And anybody who wants to help with that, or anybody who wants to volunteer in general, if you've got time and you're willing to do some legwork, we have some tasks that could be parceled out to people who have nothing better to do than sit at their computer for a few hours a week and churn away at something that we need to do, but we haven't to get done yet. So if you're interested, contact one of us.
No, I'll talk to you. I've got a lot of years with this group now too, and you've talked to me. Yeah.
I think that historical societies and archives, they have no option but to figure out something to do with digital, because starting in the last couple of years, virtually everything is digital and very little is on paper. And the government acknowledges that in the sense that email, for example, electronic copies are legitimate documents.
Yeah.
That's true. But if it goes away, it goes away.
A lot of the problem with that,
you have the talk with them and they say, yeah, we'll take it. If it goes away, it's gone.
But what I took away from your Tim, what I took away from your point is that we can't sit around and wait for the Historical Society to digitize all those photos from the 30s and 40s that we want to see. If we want to see them, we're going to have to go down and do the work and pull them out ourselves.
No, I'm saying you give them the photos.
I'm talking about what we're going to get from them.
Oh yeah, no, they sell copies.
Yeah.
They sell copies. That's what they're going to give you.
Yeah, but Jurgen, one of the things with the problems with digitizing records in the past has been the media that they've been stored on.
Definitely
becomes obsolete. The way they used to store them on huge discs,
right.
And then they went to double-sided high-density discs, and then they went to CD-ROMs, and then they go all the way back to the point where some of this stuff was stored in magnetic tape. So, and that's been getting better. And
the medium is a different. The medium is a different issue than the encoding that's done. The encoding can be moved from one medium to another. It's
the format that's the most important.
That's the important thing.
And guys, we don't need to discuss that issue.
You want to fix it. I mean, this is the worldwide problem, not just down there, and it's been undertasked for 40 years with no solution.
We will cross that bridge when we come.
Great problem.
That's not going to be our problem to solve. We just hope
No.
we hope that somebody solves it at some point. For
Do they have images that we want?
We're talking past each
They
other.
That's the question.
they definitely have images. I know about images that they have that I want.
Well, they will make you what you want to use.
Well, it depends on who you're talking to and who's going to work during the quarantine too, Tim. So it hasn't all been easy sailing in the last 2 months.
Well, I understand that, but that's aside from, I mean, if you have a project that you worked out with them, they will have a rate for what they do.
Yes.
I'm talking from 40 odd, no, close to 50 years of experience with them.
Aware
That's
of,
how they do.
Aware of it.
aware of that. Yeah. Part of
Yeah.
what we need is people to put together projects for them to work on. Part of what we need is for people to go down and spend time in the archives searching for things. So
Well, I think you have a grand project underway here.
we can use some volunteer help. Folks, I've got
Okay,
to
I'll
go.
give you-
So I'm gonna bow out of the meeting. I'm also going to announce long after the fact that I recorded the meeting